put a value on it, it turns out to be enormous. It would be the 5th or 6th largest economy just of volunteers in the world. And interestingly, we focus a lot on charitable giving. But you can think of volunteering as giving, but of time instead of money. And if you put a value on that time, as you say, what would it take to pay workers to do that job, all the volunteers, and add that up, it would turn out to be just a massive amount of money. And the giving of cash as a share of all philanthropy that we measured in these countries is only about 1/3. And 2/3, if you put a value on it, is the value of the time that people give. So it turns out that volunteering is contributing more to philanthropy than is all of the paid cash together. So what does that mean then about whether volunteers drive out paid staff, which is a big concern in the sector. People are fearful that if you emphasize volunteering, it will be replacing paid workers with volunteers, and that would not be a good idea. And similarly, if you bring in paid workers, you're liable to reduce the value of volunteering and the emphasis on volunteering. We finally have some data to analyze that. And if it were the case that this was right, you would expect that most of the countries will fall in the top left corner and the bottom right corner, because you'd expect below average volunteers to be associated with above average workers, and similarly you'd expect below average workers, paid staff, to be associated with above average volunteers. You understand? So if the two are opposites, you would expect all the countries, most of the countries, to fall into one of those two cells in this table. So what does the data tell us? It turns out that only 16% of all the countries that we have data on fall into that pattern. And that the much more common pattern is just the opposite, where below average paid staff seem to be associated with below average volunteering, and above average paid staff with above average volunteering. And so this creates a puzzle. How can this be the case? Does anybody want to venture a guess on why that might turn out that way? Who knows something about volunteering and paid staff? And why is it that countries with paid staff that are high or above average as a share of the total turn out also to have volunteer staff that are above average? Any guesses? No guesses? Are you brimming with an answer? What's that?
Gentleman is saying that
Волонтеров должен кто-то организовывать.
you still need to organize.
Okay, yeah. So, we always think of volunteering as an individual act, but it really is a social act. And volunteers are much more likely to work when they feel like their work is being valued and is being structured. And so it has to be organized. You have to be recruited, it has to be structured, it has to be managed, and it turns out that it's much more valuable for people when it is built into the operation of the organization. So volunteers really feel like they're making a contribution that is appreciated by the organization and used wisely by the organization. So this is another myth that's coming down. And what we have now done as a parallel to that UN handbook that I referred to, we have basically said to the people who do labor force surveys that they were missing a crucial labor force component because they had never bothered to measure volunteering. There was no measurement of volunteering around the world. And so we got busy and we said, no, you've got to come up with a definition and you've got to develop a manual. And they said, okay, since you're think you're so smart, why don't you do that and present it to our annual conference 5-year conference. So out of this comes this very important manual on the measurement of volunteer work, which you'd be happy to know Eurostat has recently begun to implement. So you will be getting solid volunteering data. I just learned this yesterday. Very important breakthrough. So we've now got a vehicle for measuring the scale of the nonprofit sector, the workforce of the nonprofit sector, and the volunteer activity of the nonprofit sector. So that's volunteering, but what about the financial support of the sector? And where does it come from? And I think the myth, the belief, widely carried to your country as well as many other countries, is that philanthropy is the biggest source of support. Is this causing noise? So, very widespread belief that philanthropy, that is private giving, is the major source of support of the nonprofit sector. If it's not generally, it is in the United States. So when we began to gather data, again, we had a basis for making a judgment about this. This is true. Is philanthropy the major source? We already had a hint from what we saw in the statistics that I quoted at the table that showed how with NPISH that left out. When we had these data, we had a very much clearer notion. And what we discovered is if you take all of these organizations that we could gather data on, 34 countries ultimately, and ask what is the source of the revenue of this whole bundle of organizations, the surprising result that emerges is that fee income, that is charges for the services that the organizations provide, is the largest source of income. It's a little over half of all the income of these organizations. The second largest, again, it's a surprise to many people, but once you saw the data that were up there, it won't be a surprise to you. The second major source is government, providing about 35% on average of the revenue of the sector. And philanthropy, therefore, was pretty much the lagging partner in the support of the sector. Only about 12% of the revenue came from philanthropy. So those of you who are struggling to make your nonprofit sector work, relying mainly on charitable giving, are fighting a really tough battle. There's no country that I've seen, except maybe this one, where philanthropy is the major source of revenue. Very, very hard to cope with the kind of problems that the sector is trying to cope with, relying solely on philanthropy. And so this brings us to the 8th myth, that philanthropy surely is the chief source of civil society revenue in the U.S. When I asked what percent of the revenue of the U.S. nonprofit sector comes from philanthropy, most people think it's at least 70%. I probably would get that answer here if I asked you. But it turns out that that's not the case at all. So this chart shows you the sources of revenue of a group of countries for whom the largest source of revenue is fees and service charges. And the U.S. is very much in that. So this is all countries first, and you can look down this list about the third all the way from the bottom to the United States. And if you can look across, you'll see that the United States, our nonprofit sector gets about 57% of its income from fees. It gets about, if I'm seeing this right, 31% from government, and it's getting only about 13%, about the international average from philanthropy. So most of these countries, and you'll see it's a very strange collection. It's much of Central and Eastern Europe, it's significant Latin America, it includes the U.S., it includes other so-called liberal countries, liberal in the sense of economically liberal, traditional meaning of like Australia. And that's very different from interestingly, it's the smallest countries that are getting won something, I think.
Победа.
You know, we're in a monastery here.
Это монастырский флаг.
The other countries, the ones that are the largest countries in terms of their sector, boy, you're going to count off 6 countries. That's great. I'll have to time the new slide to come up with the.
Слайды что поставить, чтобы не появлялись.
So here's the thing. My timing is off. So you'll notice that there's a second group of countries. These tend to be the countries that have the largest nonprofit sectors in the world, and most of their resources are coming from government. This is true of most of what we are taught of the welfare state, telling us that indeed those states have significant funding going into human services, but they're not delivering those services. The delivery is being done heavily by nonprofits. And it reaches, you know, great. It reaches, you know, very high levels. You know, 77% in Ireland and 77% in Belgium, 64% in Germany coming from the state. So they have built very strong partnerships between government and the nonprofit sector. Which is really significant change in our thinking that's come out of this. Ninth myth. This is going to get into a whole new bundle of topics. There's been a widespread belief that the nonprofit sector is fundamentally labor intensive. It's service economy, it therefore does not need capital. And so long as we weren't in the sort of electronic age, you could believe that. But increasingly, it's clear that nonprofits require. Is anybody keeping track of what number that is? Yeah, I think we just got midnight. I don't think we're going to turn it off. It's only, yeah, it's only been doing that for what, 100 years?
No, it is a renewed development because it was given to the church only a couple of months ago.
I see.
So.
They're still trying to make it work right.
Yeah.
We can't count right now. So, does everybody know what labor intensive means versus capital intensive? So this sector, it has not. This sector has a disadvantage when it comes to raising capital. The business sector can go into the stock market, it can issue stock, and it doesn't pay anything for the stock. It doesn't have to pay it back. These are all it agrees to do is pay dividends if it earns profit. If it doesn't earn profit, it doesn't have to pay the dividends. So that's a great advantage. Nonprofits can't do that because they don't have owners and they can't distribute profit. That was one of the conditions. So what we discovered is that in the United States, whenever the government begins a new program that involves charging out, outsourcing it's called, to private providers, the nonprofits that are frequently pioneering a service are at a disadvantage because the for-profits can quickly build facilities, let's say home health care facilities, and begin to absorb that revenue that is coming from the government funds. So we have done some surveys, so just differentiate, you know, the operating revenue, that's the money you need to operate in a particular year to keep your organization going. But that's not the only kind of revenue that you need. You need the revenue that goes into the plant and the equipment that lasts over a period of time. And for that you need investment capital, which is different from operating income. And nonprofits have tended not to pay a lot of attention to investment capital. You need investment capital to build buildings, buy machinery. You also need it for what we refer to here as soft investment capital. That's training for your personnel, strategic planning for your organization. These are all the requirements of investment capital. And even in the U.S., it turns out that nonprofits have not been terribly successful in generating investment capital. So this is the result of a survey that we did in the US. It asked the organizations, do you need capital for various purposes? And then did you succeed in getting it? And the purple is the organizations that said, yes, we need capital for technology, for program development, for building and land. 80–90% of the organizations said that. But when it came to succeeding in getting the capital, only 35–40, if that, indicated that they were succeeding. So all of that is causing a real push to find new ways to bring capital into the social purpose arena. And it turns out that some really interesting developments are going on, and we are doing actually a study in this country to see how much of these new developments are beginning to show up in Russia. And the answer so far is none, very few. But the hope is that over time, they will, all of you will find your way to some of the investment houses and begin to introduce them to what's going on elsewhere around the world. And what's going on around the world is what I'm calling philanthropy's Big Bang. A whole array of new actors and new tools are emerging around the world to transfer capital from private investment funds, not from charity, not from philanthropy, but from private investment capital into social purpose activity. And a number of these are new social capital investment funds. So Bamboo Global Energy, Social Capital Partners, Acumen Fund. See what other ones I have here. These are all of Greyco's ventures up at the top. Avishbar International in India. These are funds that have been created to accumulate private investment capital to invest in social purpose activities. And many times they're investing in social ventures, and they have come forth a whole host of entrepreneurs who are coming up with inventive ideas for finding products that they can sell to the so-called bottom of the pyramid at prices that are much better than the people living at the bottom of the pyramid are paying for the products now, and still yield a profit for the social entrepreneur. So they're doing socially useful investments. So that, for example, they're creating solar panels that can be sold to farmers in Africa living out in the desert so that they can grow crops and refrigerate them and then get them to market. And they've lowered the cost sufficiently to make this feasible. A whole host of inventive products. Another one is social entrepreneurs in India. We're dealing with the problem that kids going to school in India will drop out of school around the 7th or 8th grade, hundreds of thousands of them. And they finally discovered that the reason they were dropping out of school is they literally could not see the blackboard that the teacher was writing on because their eyes were bad. And there was no way that their parents could buy eyeglasses because the eyeglasses cost more than a year's wages. They were $100, $200 for eyeglasses. So this group began to experiment, and they were able to produce eyeglasses that they could sell for $3 to $5 a pair because the volume was so enormous, and they could make a small profit and pay that back to investors and still offer a product to the parents. So this is the kind of thing that's going on, and these are the investment funds that are beginning to do it. And it's this is, if you'll excuse a little bit of a commercial pitch. There are two books that I just recently done because I've gotten very fascinated by how are we going to finance social purpose activity at a time when governments are cutting back and philanthropy is not growing, and yet the problems out there have continued. And the way that I'm exploring and trying to encourage is by finding new leverage vehicles that generate money from the private investment market and bring it into the social purpose arena. The final myth that I want to talk about is the question of the dynamism. So here again, the widespread belief is that the nonprofit sector is not very entrepreneurial, and it's a little bit slow on the take up. It does not grow as rapidly and as inventively as the for-profit sector. And so we've gathered data on the growth of the sector that we can compare to the growth of the overall economy in countries. And one worker for that is a very striking story. So this is the growth, annual growth of the nonprofit sector in 5 countries where we have time series data. So the Czech Republic, Belgium, Canada, the United States, and Japan. This is the growth rate of the nonprofit employment. I think it's employment. This is the growth of the GDP in those countries. And here's country by country. And what's striking is that every single country, the growth rate of the nonprofit revenue is exceeding the growth of the overall economy, suggesting that this sector, far from being a laggard, is really a leader in growth of employment, growth of income. These are growth rates. It's not to say that it is bigger than the rest of the economy, but its growth rate is growing at a more rapid rate. So there's a lot of neat challenges that this data poses to a lot of our favored beliefs in the sector, and its intent is to make people start thinking in a different way about this sector, to see it as a source of growth, to see it as having special contributions, to see it as a source of dynamism, and in order to take it more seriously. So let me pause there and
thank you very much for the lecture. So should I bring light again? Yeah. So any questions maybe for clarification? Okay.
University of Wrocław, from Poland on exchange. I have 3 questions, but I don't know if we have time for that, so can I ask 3 or 4?
You can try.
Okay, so 2 questions concerning your presentation and third one concerning my research. So first question is, do you think that, for example, this 35% of revenues of civil society organizations coming from government is also some kind of risk? Because when you showed us
risk.
Yeah, because you showed us civil society as some kind of service delivery center. But also civil society is sometimes some kind of watchdog. And for example, concerning example of Poland, when we see how grants of government are given, we can see that it's mainly given to the organizations which are not so, I would say, aimed to have a watchdog relations with the government. So do you think this is the risk that relying on the governmental funding will deprive NGOs working in different areas than just service providing from effective work? This is the first question. The second question was that you think that the growth of the revenues and general growth of the last slide, so you showed us in the third sector comparing with the total economy, is it the case that the third sector is already growing? The economy is at the stable phase, I would say, while the third sector is still trying to find a place on the market. And this dynamism in some way support this higher growth. And the last question concerning my research, because I'm the beginning of my I would say research work, because I'm a PhD candidate, and I'm here to make researches on civil society in Russia. So do you think, as an experienced expert on civil society, what do you think about the question which, for example, I have to struggle in Poland, that we have big discussions? Can we use Western terminology, political terminology, especially concerning such liberal concepts like civil society, which this terminology can be directly implemented in Russia, or we have to just adjust some of these terms to the Russian specificity? So this is the third question.
Should we take them now, or should we? Are there other questions maybe we should take?
Maybe some other questions. I'm a student from high school finance, and I have a question. How do you think the political regime of the country can influence on the local NGOs?
Cindy, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear. Say it louder, please.
The political regime of the country can influence the work of NGOs.
Ah, yeah, okay. So that's very much like connected to your first question, I think. You know, this is a very difficult question to unravel in any country. There's always the fear that state financing will have this double effect. It will support, but it will also control. And there are two things that cut against that, or at least one thing that cuts against it. There's a theory in economics called principal agent theory. I don't know if you're familiar with principal agent theory. Principal agent theory comes out of economic analysis of companies that are outsourcing. And it basically says that there's a paradox that arises between a principal and an agent. So in this case, it would be the government and the nonprofit. And the paradox is that in order for the principal to control the agent, the principal needs information. And information has costs to it. You have to pay to get information to know what the agent is doing. And because of that, the agent always knows more than the principal. And so the principal is at a disadvantage, and the principal ends up, you know, we have this this aphorism that who pays the piper calls the tune. I don't know if you have anything comparable. And principal agent theory says no, that does not work that way at all, because it is very difficult for the principal to know exactly what the agent is doing. So there is a constraint. I'm not saying that it is total. You know, we're trying to sort out in this country what's happening as the government has begun to exert more, provide more support. One of the things that's occurring is that the style of advocacy is changing. It's less confrontational and it's more cooperative, but it's still advocacy. So I would certainly say that for sure, yes, it may change the style. It may cause a different type of advocacy, there may be issues that are off the table, that are difficult to raise. So it's a tough choice, but my feeling is that on balance, it has more pros than it has cons. And most of the countries that I've looked at that have created robust systems of public sector support for nonprofits inevitably find themselves with a much stronger nonprofit sector that has been able to learn how to resist government. And it's not, therefore, an open and shut case that it's always going to be negative. So the answer to your question, yes, the political environment very much affects what's possible. It may shape the style in which the nonprofit sector operates. You know, it may be more personalistic and less institutional, by which I mean it's based on friendship with somebody who's an official, and it's the organization nurturing those friendships. But at the end of the day, it can yield real influence, both in terms of putting issues on the agenda that were not on the agenda before, and also giving people ideas about how to shape the policy so that it works better. So that's my, assessment based on looking at this around the world. That it's better having the support than not having it, and that there are ways to avoid it. Your point about the third sector growth, that's a fair point. You know, anytime you have something that's big to start with and something that's small to start with, the percentage change is going to be a little bit distorted. We've looked at this in a lot of different settings, and the story has been pretty consistent that there is growth in this sector. It's not sitting stagnant, and the growth is pretty robust. How long it can keep up that rate of growth is a good question. It will not be forever. Eventually, we'll get a big base, and growth will appear smaller. But in the United States, which I showed you had is one of of the biggest workforces in our country. In every year of the decade of the 2000s, the nonprofit growth rate in employment was better than the for-profit growth rate in employment. So we're not there yet. And then your third question, can Western concepts work in Russia?
Yes, that can be directly implemented. The definitions, we saw them, we see them, etc.
Yeah, I would say that our problem is not that. Our problem is that the Western models that are being sold in these parts of the world are not really the ones being practiced in the West. In other words, the problem is the Western conceptions of themselves. We're governed by a very powerful ideology, as maybe you all are. We have an ideology of the third sector. And it turns out when you present actual data on it, it violates the ideology. You know, we have been sending people over to Central Europe for 2 decades to sell the idea of philanthropy, as if philanthropy is the solution. And it's believed very firmly in America. If I asked a group of American citizens, even people familiar with the sector, what share of the income do you think comes from philanthropy? You would be amazed at how far off the mark they are. In fact, when I started doing this research, I was a newcomer to the sector, so I was able to look at the data, and when I first started asking people how big is the sector, they would say, oh, we have these books. One of it was a book called Giving USA that comes out every year that reports the total amount of giving. And people would say, all you have to do is go to Giving USA, look up the number, and that's how big the sector is. Well, I was doing work on the government side. I found out that the amount of government support going into the sector was larger than they were saying the whole sector was. So it couldn't be true, like 3 times larger. So I think the problem is really with our own conception of what the sector is, where it is. So Western Europe, everybody had in their mind an image of the welfare state. It didn't have a welfare state. No one was doing research on it. Nobody put together the numbers. Similarly in the U.S., we have now a nonprofit sector that has got more government support by a factor of 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 than it does have philanthropic support. But you could ask a dozen Americans about it, and that's really something different. So with that as background, I would say that our real models really do actually fit here. Not all of them. Some of them fit better than others. So I've been very impressed by the shift in France, which I think has an enormous parallel for Russia. So France, some of you may know, during the French Revolution, they literally outlawed nonprofit organizations because it violated the Rousseauian notion of the common will of people. And the notion was that nonprofits represent the partial will of groups of people, and that was inferior to the general will of the people. And so they said, we're going to outlaw churches, church holdings, church endowments. You know that story from the French Revolution. But there was also a law passed that said, no, you cannot have a nonprofit sector. We're going to do all of this through the state. And that held legally up through the early 20th century, but programmatically, well into the post-war period, everything was done by the state, through the state. It was a situation very similar to what existed in this country in terms of who provides social welfare services. But then a change occurred, and the change didn't come from neoliberal groups. It came from inside the Socialist Party, Mitterrand, when he was president. And basically, the population was turning against the welfare state. The population was complaining that the big government bureaucracies were inefficient, were producing second-quality services, were not being responsive. It has echoes to some of the complaints that I'm hearing in this country. And these left-wing socialists said we have to do something to save the welfare state. It was not just to destroy it, it was to save it. And what did they come up with? 2 very radical moves for France for the first time. First, they decentralized the delivery of particularly social services, services that would alleviate poverty, deal with people with disabilities. deal with youth issues. And they connected that to contracting with nonprofits, specifically with nonprofits. And the consequence was, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, a surge of growth of the nonprofit sector financed by the state, which then began to humanize the human service delivery system. I think that model, relatively recent and relatively quick, could be a model for the future in Russia. And we have hints of it, and that's what we're trying to study now in the package, the toolkit that was passed by the Duma in 2011, 2012, the 13th Ministry of Economic Development, regional grant program, some other programs providing support to support organizations, building up the capacity of nonprofits. You can read that as, oh, what a clever state that is cutting off foreign money through the foreign agent law and is providing money through the domestic government, and it's all designed to control the sector. And there probably said, oh, or you could read it, there are contending groups inside the government. One group has said, we've got to do the same kind of reform that they did in France. I don't think they're thinking of it that way, but operationally that's what's happening. And they're pushing to humanize this government's welfare state in order to save it. While another group, maybe the security ministry, is whispering in the ear of the president that these dangerous nonprofits, we've got to control them. So both are being pursued, but for different reasons. That's an alternative explanation. So it's a long-winded response to your question.
It was a question about political regime.
Well, I think I talked about that.
Any other questions?
Thank you for your lecture. Let's assume this study is representative for sake of this lecture. Anyway, whatever number of countries were there, 40 to 69, how about other 100 countries? What happens in Asia, Middle East?
Yeah, well, there are, Middle East was not there. We did work in the Middle East in an earlier part, but we were never able to get hard data, so they're not in our data. But we worked in Lebanon and in Egypt. But Asia is here. I mean, Australia is here, New Zealand's here, Japan's here, India's here. In all of those countries, we have data. So what was reflected here is